Oh, you can hold. Yeah, that's good. Say, Pat. Don't give away my sermon yet. This is one of those passages from Jesus that you're listening to Andy and you're going, I've got this one. I've got this one. And initially, when I read it, I said, okay, I've got this one. So today we're going to look a little bit at this passage, and we're going to initially, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of set up a situation where you're all going to nod your heads and you're going to go, okay, we got this. And then there's going to be the twist at the end. Okay? All right. So that's simple enough. We have a tradition here at First Christian Church of providing a pastor appreciation weekend, which I have really appreciated. Pardon the pun. So one year for that weekend, we chose to take our family to Philadelphia. And so the girls were pretty small at the time, and so we said, girls, for this weekend, we're going to go to a city you've never been to before. We're going to go to Philadelphia. And the girls were like, what? And I said, oh, it's going to be great. We're going to go to some really old buildings, and we're going to find out where they signed the Declaration of Independence. And the girls were like, and so we did what parents do. We took the kids to some historic buildings. And as anticipated, they couldn't stand 1 minute of it, okay? So when that had gone so well, and they were so unimpressed by those buildings, then I did what any good dad would do. I took them to even older buildings, knowing that that would certainly turn the tide. So I had a very deep interest in going to an old church in Philadelphia. And as you all know, I grew up in Philadelphia, not in the city, out in the suburbs. And we would occasionally travel into the city with friends, usually during high school years. And during those times in high school years, when we went into the city, I never really had the time to explore old buildings because I was busy in the city doing other things with my friends, like eating cheesesteaks and stuff like that. So we took them into a really old church, Christ Church, one of the first Episcopal churches in the nation, founded in 1693. And so when we got into this old church, which the girls were thrilled with, and so was Allison, we had it. The first thing that really surprised us, and if you've been in this old church, you may be surprised too, was the seating arrangement. Now, some of the old New England churches, and this church would follow that tradition, and some of us have been in these old churches. Bug's shaking his head. Maybe he has. Has anyone been in any of these old churches and up in New England? And what do we notice about their seating arrangement? Does anyone know? Thank you. Thank you. That's exactly right. Thank you. Boxes. Now, if you go into these churches, what you'll notice is the seating is not as we see here, but it is seating in boxes. Can you imagine that? Okay. So if you've been, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't been, you'll Google it on the way home, and sure enough, I'm right on this one. So there's all these boxes, and to get into the box, how do you get into these? I mean, if it's not this kind of seating, how do you get into these boxes? It has a gate, right? So you open your gate, you go into your box. Now you notice my terminology here is your box, right? So we've got these boxes, and what it'll be is a box and a box and a box and a box. That's how it works. Okay. So if you go into your box, you'll be seated actually in a configuration like a box. And what's funny about that is that some of the congregants did not face forward. Okay, so you have some portion of people that as they're sleeping, you don't get to see them sleeping. You only see the back of their head while they're sleeping in church. This way, this formation allows me to see you all snoozing when I'm getting boring. So folks move into their boxes, and let's just speculate about how this box situation works, okay? So we've got folks in the front, folks in the middle, folks in the back. Who's in the front? I wonder. So we got into Christ Church, and Pat, you could pull up that placard now. When your box would also have, at some point, it would be identified with your placard. This one's a little nicer than would have been there 200 years ago. But And it's also difficult to read. But what we can notice is that it is large, and that it is bronze, and that it has a whole bunch of information on it. And that information would be all the people who are allowed to sit in this box. Now, this is what's interesting about this box, and the next slide, which I thought we could show, is me in church sitting in this box. Okay? And I'm really not worthy to sit in this box because this is the box that's designated for George Washington and his family. This is his seat in church. I thought this was kind of neat because, you don't always get to sit where the president sat. So that's where George Washington would sit, and I'm sitting there too. And then I also thought I'd pull up another slide here of the girls just so you could see how excited they were to jump into George Washington's seat. Later on, we had some conversation with Kira about this trip. She remembers nothing of the trip. She's never been to Philadelphia, so this is some kind of other image of another human because she has no memory of it. So we can look at this, we can listen to what I'm saying, we can think about what Jesus just said, and we can go, aha! This one we've got. How do we feel about George Washington being seated in his family's box right here? Because that's the way the seating worked. The important folks, they sit in the front, then less, and then less. How do we feel about that based on what Jesus just said? And we go, we've got this figured out. The answer is, bad job, George Washington. Jesus is not pleased. So we kind of initially start in a position of judgment, and then also in a position of sort of saying, well, this just doesn't make sense, and no wonder we don't do that anymore. I had the opportunity to go to the very first Disciples of Christ. You could think of it this way, Disciples of Christ congregation. There's a little bit of political wrangling that I'm not going to get into now, and Glenn knows about this also, but it's called Cane Ridge, and Glenn's no doubt been there. Have you? Okay. Cane Ridge. It's our original church, and it's a log cabin church. Has anyone been there? Surely. Okay. So we go to Cane Ridge. We see this log cabin church. And what you'll notice, and it's interesting about this log cabin church, is that we want to ask some questions from a modern perspective. Were white people and black people, do they worship together? The answer is yes. But then the answer is also sort of no. And do we know how we worked that out in the issue of racism? We put the white people down here, and then where do we put the black people? That's right. And you'll see in Cambridge, there's a little balcony in the very back. And they actually had a staircase. It was a ladder. They went up the ladder to the back, and then we're going to be down here in the congregation. What does Jesus have to say about that? Oh, no. Okay, so we're all in the same position thinking about what Jesus has to say to us today. Be careful about promoting yourself. Be careful about putting your name on the plaque. Be careful about sitting in the front of the church because you're rich or you're connected. We're all on the same page with that kind of thinking. But a lot of times what happens is, first of all, if Jesus said it and if he taught it, it means it's a difficult lesson. And he's always up to something. So don't think you can figure Jesus out in a 2-minute. And you also got to have to respect the fact that they had this kind of box sitting all up and down New England, and it still exists today. So we've got to wonder, why did they do this? We could put ourselves in a position of judgment, just say, well, they just weren't Christian as much as we are today. Or you could start to wonder about history a little bit, and this is my wondering. My wondering is that I think what Jesus was really saying in this sermon today wasn't just the simple message of making sure you don't sit in the front. But I think Jesus was really asking a deeper question, and this one's going to be a little more challenging. The question I think he's asking us today is, where is your place in the pecking order? Because what you'll note about what Jesus said was, you don't want to necessarily sit at the place of honor because you could get degraded. But he also mentions if you're in the downgraded position, you might be upgraded. Did you notice that? So Jesus isn't just saying, take the position of least and you'll be covered. And that's what we want to do. When we hear a message like this, we say, well, golly, I don't want to be in a position where folks are going to judge me, so I will take a seat at the back. And historically, what we find in worship is that we have our back pew sitters, okay? And I know them very well, those three ladies back there. And you don't want to upgrade those three ladies because they want to be in the very back, okay? So we think, well, that's maybe a solution. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord, Scripture says. So we're gonna try and figure out how to do that. But this is the problem. And the problem has to do a little bit with Christ Church, and it has a little bit to do with Jesus. His message isn't really easily summarized. And this is how kind of this message came to me in a strange way in the middle of my life. And some of you know this story, and I'm going to retell it a little bit differently than I have in the past, give you just a little more background than I have in the past. I was in a position to volunteer to join the Habitat for Humanity board when I was living in Kentucky, and I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea, so I joined the board. And I was initially given the responsibility of helping to build various houses that we were building in and around our community. And it was fun because I like building stuff and I like using my hands. And so I served on the board for 2 years and I helped where I could help and everything was fine. Then catastrophe struck. What happened was we got wind of the fact that there's this blitz build going on, and they've been going on in different locations around the country and usually in large cities. And the idea was, could Habitat build 20 houses in a single city in a single week? And the answer was, yes, they can, if you have an army of volunteers, okay? And so to orchestrate the kind of movement of lining up all these volunteers, they needed someone who could really rally the troops, and they found that someone in former President Jimmy Carter, who took an interest in Habitat for Humanity, because the founder of Habitat Humanity was a guy named Millard Fuller, who was the disciples minister living in Georgia at the time. And Jimmy Carter, as we know, has roots from Georgia. So Millard Fuller and Jimmy Carter got together, and they started to do these blitz builds where Jimmy Carter would give his name to it, and then we would line up a lot of volunteers. We'd build a lot of houses and help poor people. Jimmy Carter got this concept. He said, I want to go to Appalachia. And they said, well, there's no large cities in Appalachia. And he said, I'll do 7 cities in 7 days, and we'll build 100 houses. So my little affiliate, tucked out in a small, very small community in Kentucky, got wind of the fact that we were going to build 7 houses in 1 week, which for us was absolutely unimaginable, and that Jimmy Carter was going to come to our work site, and that the Secret Service was going to come 2 weeks prior to make sure that we put up fencing and that we did all this stuff that was necessary for a presidential visit. Our eyes about fell out of our sockets, and we were super excited, said, oh, this is going to be really neat. So we planned and planned and planned and planned, and the Secret Service had to know exactly everything about the site, everything about the neighborhood around the site. They had to have a very tight timeline on every single thing that was going to happen. And we got really scared by that because we were not used to any of that kind of protocol. So we had a very tight timeline. He was going to arrive exactly at this time. He was going to do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And, you know, these people were going to be here while he did this. And we were really nervous, quite honestly. And so the day came and Jimmy Carter showed up. And I was involved in the security side of things. So that was kind of my obligation. And so I had worked on perimeter fencing, and I had worked on where different people were going to need to be stationed and controlling access to the work site and that kind of thing. So Jimmy Carter shows up, and we're expecting him to efficiently move through this schedule because we've been told that he knows this schedule and he knows exactly where he's going to move in the timeline. So he shows up on the work site, and he immediately goes to the wrong house. And we're all losing our minds. And someone went up to him and said, excuse me, Jimmy. I don't think you refer to him Jimmy. Excuse me, Mr. Carter, President Carter, former President Carter. You can't go in this house. You're supposed to be working on this house. He said, I don't want to work on that house. I don't know how to do that. I want to put up this siding. We're like, oh, no. oh, no, you're not allowed to put up siding. You're not supposed to be on a ladder, buddy. He's like, oh, I got it. So he's on the work site, and he's out of control, and we're scared, and we don't know what's going to happen next. And the Secret Service is looking at me. It was really cool. I had a neat day. So he goes through his thing. He's supposed to leave and go on to this next city. He's there for this, and they told us over and over and over, he is on a very tight schedule. He will not be doing anything other than he has to get it back in this car and go. So he's working, and we say, it's time for you to leave. And he goes, I don't want to leave. I'm not going to leave. I'd like to have lunch. I'm starving. I haven't had any food. And we go, lunch! Oh, no. So we had a lunch prepared for the former president of the United States. So we say, well, we're having peanut butter and jelly. He says, that's great. Get me a P&J. That'd be perfect. So we fetch him and Rosalind a soda, a peanut butter and jelly. They sit down at this picnic table. Then we have a huge problem. The problem is no one wants to be anywhere near this picnic table. Okay? Who is going to sit down with a former president of the United States and have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Okay? So I looked at the entire board, and I was like, you're the president. You're the vice president. I don't even know who you are, but you're definitely older than me. I'm going through the whole list, and I'm just looking at these people. No one's moving. Why? Because Jesus said, you take the position of the very least, right? And everyone knows that if someone's going to sit down at that picnic table, what's going to happen? They're going to have the eyes of every single person from the affiliate looking at them going, you think you're all that, but you're not. And so in a moment that I will never forget, I looked and said, there is two problems here. The first problem is I'm not worthy. The second problem is this guy is having lunch with his wife, and no one is hosting him. No one's sitting with him. And the moment will never come back again. So I grabbed my soda. I walked over there. I felt like I was walking through fire. I will never forget it. I thought I would sit down and have someone grab me on the shoulder and throw me maybe across the street. Instead, I just started talking to Jimmy Carter. And he said, what are you drinking? I said, it's an L81. They were donated. He goes, what's that? That's a local soft drink they have here in Kentucky. And he said, well, I want one of those. Can I have yours? I said, yes, sir, you may have it. And he's throwing down this L81. Oh, my! So it's not going to be simple enough to walk away from today's message and say, okay, the solution is cower in the back of the room. The solution is sit in the back. The solution is be invisible. The solution is you just wait on the sidelines. And that's what we want. We want to understand where we are supposed to sit. Where do we fit in? Well, guess what? You're going to have times in your life where you don't know where you fit in. You don't know. And when you don't know where you should fit in, you're going to have to let your empathy and compassion lead the way. And you're going to have to let some of that judgment fall where it's going to fall. So anyone that became a good student of history says, well, George Washington certainly blew it. Well, no, he didn't, because guess what? Who do you think is keeping the lights on and funding the minister at this very old congregation? It's George Washington. Okay? You don't have a church if you don't have some rich people paying the bills. So let me finish by mentioning that this is what we do in our spirituality. We get a rule that we can't quite figure out, and we want to get it figured out. So what we do is we take, instead of being superficial and kind of where we can see it, we put it into the underground. We get subtle. We add subtleties, okay? So the takeaway is that we're not going to set up a pew and put our name on it. But the subtle way that we do what Jesus is concerned about is we choose a pew, do we not? I have it all memorized where each one of you sits, so I know you can nod your heads. And so you've got your spot. And you know what? I totally get that, okay? Because I did the same thing. And I have a spot, too. It's up here. I love my spot. We all have our spots. But this is the problem with your spot. Your spot represents something more than just where you sit in church. It also represents the fact that each one of us have in our minds that we've been coming here for a long time. And that's a wonderful thing. We wouldn't have a church without it. But with that coming here with a long time, not only do we establish a spot in the church where we sit, we also establish in our minds a spot where we represent a pecking order that we have in our church. And you know what? That's good. We need leaders. And we need folks that have been around here a long time, know the history of the congregation. That's great. But doesn't it always butt up eventually with the fact that we get new faces come in and go, I thought maybe we should just do this. And what do we say if we've been around a long time? We've never done it that way before. Okay, so for churches to be healthy, for an organization to be healthy, we've got to listen to what Jesus says. And what Jesus says is take your place in the room. And it's not just in the back corner. And it's not hovering outside because you're not worthy. Take your place and do what God has asked you to do. He's going to ask some of us to be leaders. And some people aren't going to like the way we lead. And he's going to ask some of you to serve on a committee. And someone's not going to like what your committee decides. And he's going to ask you to do some things. And you're going to have to bear a little bit of judgment for that. But take your place, because we need some folks that aren't saying, well, I'm humbled, so I don't do anything. Therefore, I'm covered. No. Step into leadership. Step into a group. Yes, it could be a little bit dangerous, but living for Christ is always a little bit dangerous. Last story. One time Jesus was preaching, and his disciples were just like me on the Habitat worksite. They were managing the crowd. And crowd management in this case meant that while Jesus was preaching, they tried to keep the place under control so the adults could listen to what he was saying. The problem was, in this story, the children showed up. And so the disciples did exactly what they were supposed to do. They said, look, we don't need kids running around while Jesus is trying to teach. Right? And we all know that story from Scripture. And then Jesus brought a new teaching. Right? And that new teaching was a very powerful message that Jesus said, let the children come to me. Jesus said, let the power be rebalanced with those that have nothing in worship with those that are established. We need both in a beautiful congregation. We started our worship today. I could have cried. Absolutely gorgeous rendition of Jesus Loved Me. And again, Allison just did a lovely job. Beautiful song. And so powerful that we are a powerful congregation when we include those that have no power next to those that have power, when we work together as a team, and when we sometimes notice that we come to sit down and worship in our pew and someone who's never been here before just wandered into our pew. And we say, welcome. Can I sit here with you? Amen.